Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Mark Lobosco in San Francisco, California. Mark is the Vice President of Talent Solutions at LinkedIn. He's responsible for leading the global pre-sales, sales, and customer success teams for LinkedIn's Talent Solutions business. Mark also sponsors a number of company-wide diversity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, and he's the executive sponsor of HOLA, LinkedIn's Latin Employee Resource Group. Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Angela. I'm excited to connect.
Well, I am so excited to talk with you, and I'm excited to focus on diversity in the workplace for today's conversation. There are so many important discussions going around about diversity right now, including issues from race to gender, age, disabilities, and many more. And on top of that, we are commemorating the 50th year of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy this month, and this is a really great time to have this conversation. So with these things in mind, LinkedIn recently released a report on 2018 global recruiting trends, and I'm really excited to dig into your findings and find out why they're so important to us today in the workplace. So, in your report, you actually broke down diversity into multiple pieces. You mentioned diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And there's a quote in that report I loved. I actually mentioned it in a column, and I received a number of emails about this quote. And so I wanted to ask you about it. It said, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and belonging is dancing like nobody is watching. So it's just an awesome quote. Can you help me to understand what this quote means and why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for many companies for many years, they've been, thinking about, the importance of diversity, which is a lot about, building a diverse workforce that includes people from all backgrounds, no matter the race, no matter your gender, your sexual orientation, whether you're an introvert or extrovert, wherever that may be. And that is clearly a big priority for many companies, including LinkedIn. But to think about diversity alone without then thinking about what it means to create an inclusive environment where you're creating a culture that facilitates fairness, equality, and respect for all points of view. And then more importantly, then ensuring that not just respecting people's perspective, but ensuring folks feel comfortable that they can express it. So that feeling of belonging, which is really where the kind of magic happens. And so as we think about, diversity, we also think about inclusion and belonging, because you could be creating a diverse workforce as it relates to, who a company is recruiting into the organization. But if you're not creating that environment of inclusivity, and if someone has to put on, a different face when they walk into the office, it isn't the type of environment that is going to keep people engaged because they're not feeling like they're them true selves when they come to the office. And so when we think about diversity, it's always going to include, inclusion and belonging and this idea of dibs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just an incredible way to think about it. If you've, sometimes if we're not the person who is experiencing feeling different, maybe we've never really thought about it this way. And I know for me, I've worked at a number of places where I was different, or I worked with coworkers who felt different. And, when you mention being asked to dance and this kind of thing, it's interesting. One of my careers, I actually took golf lessons because all the executives went golfing. And I thought the reason I'm not being invited to go golfing is because I don't know how to golf. And so I was going like 3 days a week and taking golf lessons. And even after I learned how to play golf, I still was not invited. And I think that this quote really kind of speaks to that that difference between, just being there and really being there. It's just such a big difference. Well, I know in your report, you also looked at the percentage of companies that are focusing on these issues, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I'm curious to know How did we look? And are the numbers, do you think they're positive, or like what direction are we going in?
Yeah, I think based upon our research, we are definitely headed in the right direction. Where for diversity, inclusion, and belonging, all three kind of areas scored about 50% in regards to very important or extremely important across all three of those dimensions, which definitely shows things are headed in the right direction. I think not just LinkedIn, but other companies are realizing that it goes above and beyond just thinking about recruiting a diverse workforce. Because, again, if you're just recruiting a diverse workforce and then, folks get to the party and they're not feeling like, their dance moves are respected, or no one's even asking them to show those moves, we're not going to be making the progress we all need to make.
That's interesting. I mean, so have you looked at these numbers before? Or is this kind of the first time that LinkedIn has taken a look at the number of or the percentage of companies that are focusing on diversity, inclusion, and belonging?
This is the first time we've gone this deep on kind of this area. And so we're excited to kind of build from here, in regards to what trend we see on a year-over-year basis.
Of course, yeah. I think it would be really interesting to see, like, in another year or 2 years, how this continues to evolve, if it continues to become more and more of a focus. So I'm curious, from your perspective, why do you feel like companies are focusing on diversity? Why is it important? And, why are we putting this emphasis?
Yeah, I mean, I think, more and more companies are realizing, and the research supports it, that, more diverse teams win. When you have a team of folks that come from different backgrounds and different experiences, you will avoid groupthink. You will have people that have a different perspective, life perspective, business perspective. And, if the environment is set up in such a way where, all of those opinions are brought to the table, and, the best idea wins, and then, you hear one opinion that can counter another. If you've got a strong leader that encourages that, you'll get to the best answer, as opposed to having a group of 8 to 10 white males, or 8 to 10 whatever it may be, that everyone has the same experience and background. You're likely not to get a diverse set of opinions. And I think companies ultimately, want to win. And so I think the research does prove that, creating diversity, inclusion, and belonging will help companies win over the longer term. And, our research, I think, supports that, where, close to 80% of talent leaders said they're focused on diversity to improve their culture, but also company performance. And I think ultimately, Angela, I think more and more people are just, recognizing and realizing it's the right thing to do.
That's great. I love that. And I think in the past, I would often talk to folks from companies that would say that it was really important that the person was a culture fit within the organization. And I think I'm seeing a little less of that now, because it's like we're starting to realize, like you mentioned, that having 8 people in the room who all think in the same way is not always helpful. So this is great. And I'm curious too, we've mentioned that diversity covers a number of different issues, whether it's race, gender, age. There's a long list of things that you could look at when you're thinking about diversity. Are there certain parts of diversity that companies are focusing in on, and which sort of issues do you think companies are the most concerned with right now?
Yeah, so gender tops the list of respondents' diversity priorities at, I believe, is about 71%. I think it's easier to track, and so it's often the lowest hanging fruit. Beyond gender, companies are prioritizing racial and ethnic diversity at about 49%, and generation diversity at about 48%. Although we are seeing folks looking into other populations as well, including people with disabilities, and then LGBTQ professionals. At the end of the day, I think talent leaders' top concerns are finding diverse candidates to interview, and then retaining them to ensure that that environment, again, is created for inclusivity and belonging.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I talk to job seekers literally every day who are worried because whether it's because they feel like they're the wrong gender for a certain role, or they feel like they're too old or too young, or whatever it is that makes them different, they're worried. And so, at least for me, I think this is super positive to hear that companies are talking about it, that they're thinking about it, that, when LinkedIn reached out to them, they were willing to admit this was a big focus for them. To me, this is just such, a positive thing. And it's interesting. I recently heard the term neurodiversity to describe even just hiring people who maybe have different, whether it's learning disabilities. I'm not exactly sure what it fully encompasses, but I was excited to sort of hear that was a new topic of conversation as well.
Yeah, like introvert, extrovert is, I think, also another important thing to think about as relates to diversity, especially in regards to creating an inclusive environment. And so great examples of if you have a room full of extroverts and type A folks that dominate the conversation, if you don't have an inclusive leader that is mindful of that, they're not bringing those voices to the table, and those voices are just muted. And so, when we think about diversity, I do think it covers a lot of different things, and just being mindful of, diversity comes in many different shapes and sizes. And so it's just great that these conversations are happening. I think the more they happen, the more you'll see leaders being able to lean into it, because I think the reality is that some of these conversations are still uncomfortable for a lot of folks to talk about, talking about race at work, talking about, diversity in regards to recruiting. And I think the more folks realize the importance of it, and that's okay to talk about these things, even if you don't have all of the answers, I think the more progress we're going to make.
Absolutely. I hate to say this, but I started working about 20 years ago, and I feel like I've just been waiting for this conversation to happen for like 20 years. And it's so nice that it's an important issue right now. But we're talking about it kind of generally, right? We're talking about an increased focus on diversity. But I'm curious from a kind of practical perspective, if a company is focused on diversity and increasing diversity, like what does that actually look like? Like how does that really play out beyond just saying we think it's important? Then what? What are they doing?
Yeah, I think it varies a lot by company. And so it's definitely not a one size fits all. I think there will likely be some strong signals if a company truly cares about diversity, or they're playing kind of lip service to it. I think one example of that would be how much does the executive team and the senior leadership team lead into these topics, and not only are they talking about them, what actions are they taking to ensure this comes to life in a really real way. I can speak from experience just, with LinkedIn, it's ultimately now core to what we do and who we are. And, one of the things that we think about is, our vision. We're a very kind of mission and vision-driven company. And our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And to accomplish that vision, we believe it's critical for LinkedIn to build a diverse team that is reflective of our members. And therefore, our company needs to reflect that. And, several years ago when we kind of put a mirror up to ourselves, we realized, we need to make some progress here. And so there's a number of things that, we've done here that I think, other folks looking at their company could look at. We've established partnerships, with external organizations like Management Leadership for Tomorrow, or organizations like Year Up to better understand ways in which we can make progress from a recruiting perspective, bringing both in, earlier career folks as well as senior or later career leaders. Investments that we've made in our employee resource groups, I think is also a strong signal for us that I think you could see from other companies that you work at. But, I think ultimately, again, I think it goes back to, looking at the kind of executive team, looking at the overall strategy of the company, looking at the programs that are being prioritized. And I think that can be a pretty good signal in where kind of diversity and DIBS generally falls within the list of priorities.
That's good feedback. That's really helpful. Given I've lived on both coasts, but I've spent most of my career kind of working in the South. And one thing I've noticed, and this is just kind of a generalization, is that I think that people who are used to working in a more diverse environment, more inclusive environment, are more comfortable sharing details about themselves. So I've noticed that there are certain pieces of information about someone's like personal life, for example, that in Memphis, where I live, they might choose to not share that in a professional setting, this piece of information, whatever it is. It could be, any number of factors. But I've noticed that the folks that I know who are living kind of on the coasts are more likely to just share more information, because it seems like the environments there are more inclusive. But of course, I don't know. I'm just... It's just a personal observation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, I think there could be a couple things in play. I think, especially if you're looking at, companies that work frequently with technology or are comfortable with it, at least. I think being more open with your opinions and how you think through social platforms probably encourages that. I think, with younger companies, maybe from the early days, they came from a place of more being informal, where kind of executives kind of grew up within the company, and they've always, from day one, just shared more about their lives kind of outside of work. I know for me, as a senior leader within the company, I often share things about my life outside of work, whether it be, when I'm in front of the stage, in front of thousands of people, I openly talk about my life outside of work, not all the details clearly, but just modeling the fact that, we're all trying to find balance between work and our personal lives. And, you have to make trade-offs sometimes, and trying to humanize myself by talking about my family. Or I just sent out our bi-weekly newsletter that we have, and I introduced the newest member of my family, which is a puppy. We just got a dog. And so just like sharing things like that, I think is just helpful. So if I'm modeling the fact that I can bring my true self to work and talk about things outside of work, I think it creates an environment where, it's okay to talk about those things, rather than, everyone has to button themselves up when they come to work. Because the reality is we're all kind of working through things outside of work, and the more you can talk about those things, I think the more comfortable people are in the work environment.
Gosh, that's for me, that's very inspiring to know that. I have to tell you, I have always worked in environments where I was so different that I didn't share very much personal information. And the very last time I went on a job interview, it was with a big corporation, and a C-level executive interviewed me. And this person said to me, "Are you married? Do you have children? Do you plan to have any children soon?" And it was a very quick sign that probably was not somewhere that I wanted to work, and was probably not somewhere that was going to be inclusive to me. I felt a little bit like they were sort of screening me, that if I did have children or plan to have any children, that it might not be a fit in their mind. And that was just really unfortunate. So to even hear that you were sharing that you had a puppy, that's incredible. I can't imagine.
It's hard too, by the way. I don't know if you've had a puppy or have one recently, but hard times the past 3 weeks.
Oh no. I hear they keep you up at night.
They do, but she's great. So she'll be with us a long time, so we'll work through the puppy stages.
Yeah, it's brief. Well, so the report also mentioned looking inward, before addressing any pipeline issues. And, I can relate to this because, they talk a lot about there being a lack of women in engineering. My undergrad is actually in engineering, and I ended up leaving engineering when I didn't really feel like it was a very good fit for me, sort of culturally, being, one of the only women. And, I'm just curious to get some of your feedback about kind of what companies could do to kind of support their existing workers if they want to look inward as opposed to just trying to recruit new talent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways that you could create that type of environment. If I were to pick one, it would probably be around this idea of creating a culture of for managers in particular and leaders around, ultimately we want our best people to stay at the company. And that if they are looking for that next challenge, if they are looking for that next experience, that it is significantly better for that person to move to another group than leave the company. And so creating this culture of, internal mobility, and that leaders should not hold their employees hostage, is one of the things that could really have a positive impact. One of the things that we've done just from a practical kind of example here is we've really embraced this idea of having a conversation with our employees around this idea of a tour of duty, which means an explicit conversation with manager to employee in regards to whether it's when you're first being hired from outside the company or joining a new team from within the company. And you align on how long can we commit to one another that we're going to kind of work together, and whether that be a year or 2 years, it's a social contract, if you will. And that at the end of it, if you're looking for your next experience, we would encourage you to find that hopefully within the company. But we recognize that at some point our employees will leave LinkedIn. And so by having these types of conversations, you don't shy away from the fact that some people are going to leave the company at some point. Better to retain the employee by going to another group if they're great employees. And so we've created this kind of culture that enables this free flowing of talent within the company, because we'd rather have our great people stay than leave and pretend that they're not going to leave at some point. So again, creating this culture of internal mobility by openly talking about the fact that people are going to leave the company at some point.
I love that. I honestly met someone really recently who is an incredibly motivated employee at the place where they work, and they are literally a month away from whatever the timeline is before they can switch jobs internally, a month. And they've tried to ask about a position that they're really excited about, and they are being told that it's too soon. And it was just shocking to me, because I thought, wow, this company is going to lose this person over a month, like just because there's not a culture of, really supporting this person moving around within the existing company. I just thought, wow, it's so hard to find good, motivated people. I really think they're going to miss out on this person when the person's not given a shot at this particular opportunity.
Yeah.
It's just,
yes.
It's just a bummer. So, but anyway, so the other thing I wanted to ask about is, if we feel like in our current environment that we're sort of not being included, there's some issues around diversity that are impacting our ability to work or impacting us day to day. I'm curious about what you would give us advice on what to do that would be constructive. And in particular, I think a lot of times we're very hesitant to talk to human resources because not every company has an HR department that's super supportive of these kinds of conversations. And so in particular, if we're working at a place where we don't know that HR is the right issue for us or the right place for us to take this issue, what could we do that's constructive, that could be helpful to help resolve this issue?
Yeah, I think hopefully you're in a company where HR is a good partner to be able to work with and think through whatever the situation is. From my personal experience here and from other companies I've spoken with, this is something that's certainly top of mind with HR, and almost all of the time it is, because it's a priority for the company, which the executive team is kind of set as a priority. So going back to the importance of that. I think when there is a situation like that, and HR may not be the best partner to be able to engage with, to think through the problem, to be able to give feedback. I would hope as an individual you could always engage your leadership team or your manager about what it is you're seeing, what it is you're feeling, because if you don't express that kind of opinion or you don't share that feedback, you're not helping create the type of change that you want to see within the company. And it's a great way to get a read for whether or not this is something that the company prioritizes based upon your conversations with your manager or with your leader. And so I think it's about, engaging, either your manager directly or another leader to talk through what the issue is and to see if they have a recommendation on how to move things forward. I think a company's values often also play a big part in this as well. Fortunate here at LinkedIn, where one of our core values is to be open, honest, and constructive. And so if that is, our value and you're working in a company that has a value, putting it through the lens of that value as, when you bring something like that up could also be a helpful tactic. And then obviously self-organizing with maybe some of your colleagues on an important topic could be something else to consider.
I like that, the self-organizing. That's a really interesting idea. It's almost like kind of getting some advocates on your side, or at least someone who can kind of empathize with where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with anything though, thinking about this is one of the things to think about is, if you're an employee and you want to bring a topic to your manager or to the executive team, usually you'll say, show me the data or give me some examples. And so one of the things also encourage is, if you're going to bring something like this up, I'd encourage you to think about, examples, data, as a way to share this as opposed to it being perceived as a one-off thing.
Mm-hmm. I actually heard someone last week giving this exact same or very similar advice. They were saying, document it. So instead of it being, I feel this way, you can come and have some real examples of this happened, and these are the things we need to talk about. It's a little more concrete that way, and there's, more that you can take action on if it's less about feelings and more about situations, I guess, or facts.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned valuing diversity and the company's values. If we are out there and we are looking for a new job in a new company, how can we tell if a company values diversity? How can we identify those companies?
Yeah, I think that, there's a number of things that you could understand when you kind of make that call. The idea of talent brand is something to think about, which is, understanding what the company's brand is as it relates to what it's like to work at that company. And it's definitely no longer a nice to have for companies to think about. I think 80% of talent and HR managers around the world agree that it's important to help kind of recruit top talent. But that's, talk and what is actually in, a brand itself, which, hopefully is a reflection of, the way the company actually is. But as a candidate, I'd say, really digging a little bit deeper and understanding the authenticity of the message and where that message is coming from. Does it feel like brand speak, or does it feel like a truly authentic message? And how does that come to life through employee quotes or through other things you may be reading about, what it's like to work at the company? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different tools in order to kind of understand whether or not that to be the case via online kind of channels. I would also, do a little bit digging around, who are some of the senior leaders in the company? How vocal are they as it relates to diversity? Have they published a long-form post on LinkedIn talking about it? Does the company talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging on their company website? Are any of the executives active on Twitter or somewhere else? I think you can do a little bit of digging, and then you can figure out, where this actually falls in company priorities above and beyond, what may be in a brand message.
Mm-hmm. I think you're totally right. I feel like the internet is one of the most powerful tools that job seekers have in terms of research, because there is so much data available, whether it's company reviews, whether it's, to kind of go off topic, salary data, all sorts of information that was not available before. You don't have to just go on a gut feeling. You can look and see what's really going on in the company. And of course, you can only get so far as an outsider, but there's a lot more information available now than even, say, 10 years ago. And you can use that in your search.
Yeah, there's a lot. Just one real practical thing is, odds are if you're living in a city and it's a big company and you've got a healthy LinkedIn network, that there's someone that you know or someone you know knows that works at that company. And so, this isn't just about asking a referral to apply to a job. This is if you're farther along in the process where you can hear firsthand from someone that works at the company. What does it feel like to work there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You can ask them to have these one-off conversations like over coffee. And I find that you can actually get much more honest, real feedback from somebody outside of the actual interview process, because when you're in an official job interview, very often the people who are interviewing you are very positive and they say really nice things, and you may ask them about the company culture, but everything is very positive because they're there to sell you, versus if you could reach out to that mutual connection, on LinkedIn who happens to, work at the same company, they may give you the real scoop.
Exactly.
So I had an example I also wanted to share with you, not just about how we can do, create diversity for ourselves, but how we can support other people sort of in the idea of diversity. I recently had a male friend share with me a situation that happened at his workplace. And what happened was that he received an email from one of his male coworkers. This person had forwarded an email to him, kind of to brag to him. And this email was actually that the male coworker had sent a pretty demeaning email to one of their female coworkers, and really was kind of putting her down and pressuring her over a project in a way that he would not have done probably to a man. And the friend actually brought this to me and said, wow, this is so crazy. I got this email from this guy. He forwarded it to me just so he could brag that he kind of bullied this woman. And first of all, I can't believe it's happening. And second, I don't know what to do about it because neither of these people report to me. So they're not my responsibility necessarily at work, but it feels bad. Like, it doesn't feel right. If we find ourselves in a situation similar to this one, what could we do to support our coworkers and try to encourage diversity in our own workplace?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think sadly it happens more frequently than any of us would like to see. I think every company is different, every situation is different, but I'd say generally, the moment someone says something to you or shares something with you that's inappropriate, and if you don't say something, they'll assume you're okay with it. And it will create an environment that will kind of continue to happen where it's okay to say something that's inappropriate. It's okay to do something that's inappropriate. And that's not cool. And so I think you need to take action. So I think there's a number of different channels, and companies have different policies as it relates to, what action you should take. My personal perspective on this is if it's someone I know, I'll say something to them, as opposed to, not saying something and then submit it through, an integrity hotline. I think, in the moment, direct feedback is always the most powerful way to get people to recognize, just as something happens, that what they said or what they did is not cool. Now, do you do it in front of a room of people, or do you pull them kind of aside afterwards? I think that's where judgment needs to be exercised. But if you say something that you are not comfortable with and it's not right, say something. And then I think other companies, most companies have some type of, integrity hotline where you can report incidents. There are, senior leaders you could seek out. Maybe your boss's boss said something, and you're like, do I say something to my boss's boss? Is that a career-limiting move? And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer here. But, the moment you are seeing something or feeling something that is not wrong, you are not being part of the solution.
I think that's right. I really like the suggestion about possibly just talking to them. I think it's possible that a lot of times when people do these little things, they may not always think of it when they're doing it. They may not be intending to, be mean to this woman just because she's a woman, for example. It might be kind of automatic. They might not be thinking of it. And in this example, if the friend had said hey man, that email was kind of intense, maybe don't send something like that again or whatever. Just having that reminder, I feel might turn the light on a little bit for some people to sort of think before they do it again. But I think you're right in that if you don't say anything, it's sort of you're comfortable with it. You're almost endorsing the behavior in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you bring up a really important point here, right? Because there's terrible situations where this happened where you're how did this person say that? I didn't even this is a bad person, bad human being that they said or did this thing. But then there's also more subtle things where the person is not a bad person and they may not recognize they're even doing something that is creating, not the environment that you want. I mean, I'll even speak for me personally. Like, one of the things that we've tried to create on my leadership team is, this inclusive environment where all voices are heard and respected. And, we'll be in the moment, we'll be debating a topic. And because I've tried to build a diverse team, there's folks on my team that are more introverted than extroverted, and I'll have some folks, two or three people that are debating a topic. And I'm mindful of it now, in that maybe in the early days they may have been really dominating the conversation, and now I am more mindful of it, where I need to pause, look around, ensure that the person that had not had a chance to speak up, has a chance to speak. And if someone hadn't pulled me aside and reminded me of that, it would have just continued. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of times it's not, just horrible things people are saying. It could be just little things that people aren't even conscious of that they're doing.
I totally think so. And on that topic, I will just add, there is one thing in particular that I notice pretty often here, both in the professional world and with friends and family, where they use the word girls in a professional context to refer to women, or they use the word ladies in a professional context to refer to women in a way that's a little bit demeaning. And I think sometimes the people who say it, they may actually be trying to be respectful, or they may think that's normal. And I think I'm starting to actually think about this and think about the responsibility that maybe I have to say, hey, by the way, I don't know if you knew, but when you say, hey, girls, to a lot of women who are in their 40s, it doesn't feel good. And you should be aware that we should maybe start calling each other men and women, especially in a professional setting. But I think those are situations where the person who's saying it may actually be totally unaware of it. And if I, as the receiver, never speaks up about it, they're never going to know the difference.
Exactly. And there's hundreds of these scenarios,
yeah.
right? Where you choose to have your offsites, whether your events are, based around sports or drinking. If you have a team that, in the past loved one thing, but you now have a diverse team where it's not an inclusive event, someone just may not be thinking about that. And so I think it shows up a number of different ways.
Totally. I think that's such a good point. I could give you so many more examples. I think these are really fantastic. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we are actually commemorating the 50th year of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy this year and this month. And although we've made some progress, it's clear that we still have a really long way to go on this issue. And I'm just curious if you have any predictions about, how diversity in the workplace will continue to evolve sort of in the years down the road, now that the conversation's on the table a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'd like to say, I've got a crystal ball and that I'm the world's leading expert on the topic, but I'm not. But I'm happy to share, my experience, as I've been a eager student to learn more about this topic and what I can do to help. I would say a couple things. I would say that it does feel, from my personal experience and the reading I've done and the people I've spoken with that are true experts on this topic, that it feels like there's been we're on the other side of just talking about this in a comfortable way, which I think is an important step. So talking about whether it's race relations in the workplace, whether it's about, why there aren't more senior women leaders at certain companies, whatever the topic is, and maybe it's just my worldview of where I sit, but, this is something 3 years ago, we just weren't having these conversations, and we are now, and it's happening more than just at the senior leadership levels, and so that's encouraging. I also think that there has started to be, and there will be more, technology innovation that will allow us to make some meaningful progress as it relates to various diversity kind of initiatives, whether it be kind of recruiting or, once within a company on the kind of inclusion and belonging perspective. But with that said, I think we have a long way to go as it relates to this topic, and thinking about various ways you can think about diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace. But I am hopeful, I would say, of where things could go. working at LinkedIn in the technology industry, certainly we have some ways to go, and technology industry has been well documented on this area. But if you look at industries that have been thinking about this and acting upon this over the past 20, 30, 40 years, you can see progress has been made. If you look at financial services, if you look at pharmaceuticals, if you look at consulting, and you can look at it by looking at the diversity of those workplaces versus the diversity of companies in tech. And whether it be executives of these companies, like Kenneth Frazier at Merck, or Ken Cheneau, who is I think retiring at Amex, but is now joining the boards for Facebook, Airbnb, and General Catalyst, I believe, is their managing director and chairman. Those types of things will only improve tech diversity and diversity in general, but it'll take some time to play out, longer than I think any of us would like it to play out. But I do believe things will get better. I just don't think it's going to happen overnight.
I like that. I totally agree. I love the fact that you mentioned that we are now starting to talk about it. I think talking about it and acknowledging it is one of the most important steps. Well, Mark, this has been excellent. Where can we go to learn more about you and more about your work?
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I often am pretty active with sharing articles and interests that I care about, and that would probably be the best place to find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. This has been great.
Thank you for having me. Really, really appreciate it.
And thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach, and on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.